recognize we're doing the best we can. So. All right, well, if you would turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 17. Maurice, do you want to try it and see if you can, just you give it a shot, maybe you can figure it out. I'd like to have the PowerPoint, but
I'll try it. Thank you.
you'll just flip the lid, it'll come back on and see
sure.
if you can.
You don't have a password to open it up here. You don't have a password.
It's on that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right, Revelation chapter 17. So we're ready to start a new chapter tonight. And quite honestly, like you see with a lot of things in the book of Revelation, there's some stuff in this.
I've got the cursor.
You do? Okay. There's some things in this chapter that are really, frankly, difficult to understand. And so, yeah, if you've got it, I'll keep talking while I'm doing this. So some things that are very difficult to understand. We do have different people have some different theories on what some of these things mean. So we will try to look at some of those, but just understand that it's not in concrete because a lot of them they're just difficult to comprehend. But remember that when John wrote this in the first century, we do know that God is talking about when he's going to punish. What entity is he talking about? Who's he going to punish? What?
The Romans.
Yeah, the Roman Empire, right? So these things do apply to them, but again, some of it's kind of, what exactly does that mean? But we do know that in the first century, they're under Rome, and this is who God is telling John that don't worry, the faithful saints are going to be rewarded, and the Romans are going to be thoroughly punished for their persecution. So we do know it applies to that. But anyway, we'll look at some of these ideas that some people have that seem like at least it could fit, but there's no way for us to know for sure. So let's start off. Let's go ahead and read chapter 17, and then we will try to end a little early tonight so you guys can get home just in case the streets do start to freeze up again. So Revelation 17, beginning in verse 1. And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was, and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Okay, so y'all got all that? Yeah. Clear as mud, right? So yeah, a lot of interesting things in here, some of which are identified and some of which we can pretty clearly figure out, and there's other things that are a lot murkier. But the very good news about the things that maybe we're not sure about, that they probably would have been sure about in the first century, it has nothing to do with our salvation. So it's not some, well, if I don't understand what this verse means, I'm not going to heaven. Well, we don't have to worry about that. So John would have understood it. The saints at the time would have understood it. And remember, we talked about maybe one possibility of why this is written in such a confusing manner, especially for looking at it, 2,000 years later, we're trying to decipher all this. Why would God have wanted John to write it this way?
So that the king would recognize it and come after him.
Okay, so that's what we all kind of believe, is that the Romans also would have been confused by a lot of this, and it's pretty much assumed that the Roman government would have got a hold of this that John was writing, and maybe didn't want them to know exactly what John was talking about them. So it's confusing, except to the saints that it was written to. So they would have understood it, but a lot of other people, including us, we struggle with some of these things. Okay, but basically what we're seeing in this chapter is John is invited here, again, to look at the judgment that God is going to deliver on the great harlot. Okay, so this is what John is looking at. And the harlot, says in verse 1, is sitting on many waters. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, the symbolism here, this is one of those that it is explained in this chapter. So again, if we look at verse 15, he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest where the whore sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So that symbol is explained. So basically, she is sitting on all these other nations, all these other ethnicities, these different kingdoms. They all basically are subservient to Rome. And that's the idea here. And does anybody remember, we talked about there were 2 beasts, and where did the 2 beasts come from? Does anybody remember? Yeah, the land and the water, the sea, right? And so the sea beast was first, and who was the sea beast? Well, y'all are failing the quiz, come on. Who was the sea beast? We've talked about that several times, so it's clear that the sea beast is this entity. Who's God going after? The Roman Empire, right. Now the land beast, we said, was given its power by the sea beast, by Rome. So who was the land beast that operated within and under the Roman government? Specifically, very antagonistic toward God. Well, this is within Rome. So this is the pagan Roman religions, okay? And specifically the worship of who? I mean, what person? Not the name, but what office? The emperor, right. So this was talking about emperor worship. That was the land beast, which operated with the power of the sea beast, right? So here you see again, sitting upon the sea. the sea beast, the Rome, they came out of that, came out of all these different peoples and all these different kingdoms and cultures. So that one makes sense. But again, it's specifically identified in verse 15. Now we see in verse 18, the last verse of this chapter, that we see the harlot is explained, right? And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. So again, who is that? What great city are we talking about that reigns over everybody else? Rome, yeah. Okay, so those symbols are pretty clearly identified in this chapter. We're not so lucky with some of the other ones, but those are pretty clearly identified. So the harlot represents that great city, or the city of Rome, the seat, the heart of this evil empire that God is going after. And so we want to notice, if you'll turn over to Isaiah chapter 1, let's look at verse 21. Because we want to notice that this type of symbolism, it's not just used in the book of Revelation. It's used a lot in the Old Testament. Okay? And when you look at some of those examples, we're just going to look at one, but there's a whole slew of them you could look at. But it's commonly used in the Old Testament describing a wicked city or a wicked kingdom as a harlot. Okay, so this is not the first time that God has used that kind of language. So Isaiah 1 and 21, one of these examples. How is the faithful city become an harlot? It was full of judgment, righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Okay, so talking about a city, a kingdom that had once been faithful to God, but now is no longer. Okay, but there are a lot of verses, especially in the Old Testament, where you see cities or kingdoms described as a harlot, meaning that they are opposed to God. Some group that is opposed to God. So the judgment that we see here in chapter 17, back in Revelation, it applies to a city that ruled over many peoples and many kings. And in John's world, in the first century, that's clearly the Roman Empire, because they dominated the known world at the time. Now, we look in verse 2. It says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So this, of course, is talking about spiritual fornication. There was plenty of physical, earthly fornication as well. But he's also talking about spiritual fornication, people that rebel against God. Okay? And so Rome was characterized at the time. And as I said, if you're curious about that, there are plenty of sources where you can read about the wickedness and the debauchery that went on in Rome, certainly by the first century. I mean, it was just out of control. Pretty nasty stuff. And that would include the emperor worship, which the Christians were demanded. They were supposed to be doing that, but of course a lot of them, including John, will not give into that. So a lot of these kings of these lesser kingdoms, they are dominated by the umbrella of Rome, and so they are drunk, as it were, with the power that they're kind of given by the emperor over their certain area. They all have to answer to the emperor, they all have to pay taxes, they all have to worship him, but in exchange for that, they're given a certain amount of autonomy in these different areas, and so they get drunk with the power that they have been given. They're also given a lot of wealth. They get to participate in the conquests that the Roman army makes possible. And so this verse 2 seems like that's a clear reference to those kind of things, which again are now in the historical record. But even in the first century, John probably would have understood that that's what God was talking about. Now, we see in verse 5 that the harlot is identified, is called something else. So who is the harlot called in verse 5?
Babylon.
Do what?
Babylon.
Yeah, Babylon the Great, right? The mother of harlots. So in other words, this is the worst of the worst. All of these kingdoms are anti-God, but none are worse than Rome. So she's like the top harlot that's in charge of all the other harlots, is basically what he's saying here. Okay, and we have seen earlier in the book of Revelation where Rome is compared to Babylon. And that term Babylon is used a lot for wicked kingdoms. Literally, Babylon was, but it's often used in reference to others as well. So remember, this is a city. It's not a literal woman that we're talking about here. And we're told in verse 5, before she identified, it says there's a mystery of some kind. Okay, there's a mystery of some kind. And the mystery, in verse 7, we notice, and the angel said unto me, why are you marveling at this? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which have the 7 heads and 10 horns. So the angel is telling John that there is a mystery with this woman, but it will be revealed. So John is going to understand, he's going to learn what this mystery is. Okay, so we'll see that a little bit later as we go on through. All right, now, something else that, again, the people in the first century, they would have easily recognized this symbolism. For you and me, it's a little bit harder unless you're a history nerd like me and you've come across stuff like this before. But most people in our century would not really, okay, well, what does this mean upon her forehead? Is that literal? Is that symbolic? What does that mean? Well, it was customary in the first century, and it would seem like this is a reference to this, it was customary for prostitutes in the public brothels in Rome and throughout the empire, but especially in the city of Rome, they would wear a bracelet on their forehead that identified